Dr. Dacy, your 8 minutes.
So Dr. Craig asserted that I haven't addressed his argument from the existence of the universe. Actually, I did try to. Perhaps I didn't make it clear. I said that the postulation of a transcendent personal cause is of no help here, since it only piles mystery upon mystery. There is a genuine mystery about how the universe began. That's why it's a burning question for a cosmologist. But unless he can give us a rough sketch of how this external, personal, timeless causation would work, then it doesn't increase our understanding of anything to point to that as a cause. And that's a point that applies to the Big Bang argument, but also to the argument from the contingents of the universe. He made a general remark that my arguments were presumptuous. I am presuming to know the mind of God. Well, all I can say is if I'm presuming to know the mind of God, then so is Dr. Craig. After all, no serious consideration of the question of God's existence could even get off the ground without attributing some beliefs and intentions to God. Actually, Dr. Craig has explained the existence of the entire universe by doing just that. But why think that God would want to create the universe? Why 13 billion years ago rather than 10 or 5? Why think that God has fine-tuned the universe for humans rather than some other kind of life? After all, there's more bacteria on Earth and in more environments than there are people. So you might reasonably conclude that what God was after was fine-tuning for bacteria. Well, if you want to deny that, then you have to start attributing beliefs and intentions to God, and I think that's unavoidable. The question is, which of these attributions are most reasonable? As for divine hiddenness, Craig pointed to his own 6 arguments for theism, and he said, well, there are the revelations, there's the evidence that God is revealed to all, and they can reasonably believe in him on the basis of those. But again, the fact that I'm here knowing Craig's arguments, and there are countless others like me who know his arguments and aren't persuaded, it means that atheism and theism is like so many other, interesting intellectual questions, a matter of reasonable unbelief. Now, he said that a clear revelation of God needs to be more effective, not just in proving that God exists, but in drawing more people into a saving love relationship with him. I think that's true. That's what God wants ultimately, according to classical theism. But think about this. I mean, if God remains hidden, then the probability of reasonable unbelievers coming into a loving relationship with him is 0, right? Whereas if he does reveal himself, then, well, I don't know what the probability of them coming into a loving relationship would be, but presumably it would be higher than 0, because they would know that there is such a being, and they would know perhaps that he wants to have a loving relationship with them. Now, as to the view that the argument from science, he rebutted that by saying that science actually presupposes the truth of theism. For example, the whole idea that the world is knowable at all, that has laws that we can understand, is something we would expect on theism and not atheism. That may or may not be true. I think scholars are divided on that. As a historical matter of fact, it may be that Christian and Muslim societies were more apt to kind of come into the scientific mode of thinking, but that wouldn't show that in order to do science, theism must be true. And of course, I didn't argue that I wasn't arguing that science doesn't presuppose theism, the truth of theism. All I was saying is that scientists have found no need to invoke God's actions in explaining nature. And I think that's all I needed to show. Craig also pointed out, he said God does act in nature, for example, in miracles. Well, that's just begging the question against the argument from science and the success of science. If there were key parts of the history of the universe that involve God's creative actions or indirect or direct actions, then why doesn't science need to appeal to those actions? as it clearly doesn't. As for the argument from the mind-brain connection, he attacked what's called reductive materialism, the idea that our minds are nothing but our brains. But of course, my argument doesn't require reductive materialism to work. It only needs the falsity of dualism, the idea that minds and brains are entirely independent. So I don't need to claim that the mind is nothing but the brain, but only that it couldn't exist independently of it. The mental could be distinct from the physical while being causally dependent on it. The alternative suggestion that the intricate correlations between mental states and brain states can be explained by the interaction of a brain and an independent mental substance, that runs up against the view that I've already discussed, which is how do you explain the causal interaction between a totally spiritual substance and a physical substance? I think that in light of the mind-body problem and the evidence about the brain and how it sensitively determines the mind, I think anyone who still believes in substance dualism ought to have somebody else's head examined. As for physical survival, he says, well, God doesn't really need dualism to resurrect people and bring them into heaven. That's true. It doesn't logically, there's no logical connection there. Maybe God reanimates your body at the appropriate time after your death. Or you could swap your original body with a new body that will go on to the afterlife. Well, here theism is starting to sound less like the Passion and more like the dawn of the dead. But more importantly, if all these resurrected people have actual physical bodies, well, where are they? Several years ago, the Pope told us that hell is a state of mind, not a place, but if hell's inhabitants have bodies, they must be someplace. I think the only thing more bizarrely incredible than spiritual survival is the idea of physical survival in the afterlife. In regards to evolution, again, he said it's presuming to know the mind of God, that maybe God has a different notion of perfection that we do. I think if we look at biological structures, we look at their history and their present functioning, we can determine what criteria must have guided the process of their design. Eyes are for seeing, and since they're complex systems that could not arise by chance, we know that the process that created eyes, whatever it is, must have been guided by that criterion. If I told you that an intelligent designer was behind that process, you couldn't reasonably deny that the designer followed that same criterion. Yet by a more rational placement of the optic nerve, say, eyes could have performed their function better, or the tubes for breathing. So if God made eyes, I'd say they are inferior by the standards that must have governed his design. That's just the reasonable conclusion on the basis of the evidence and what criteria must have guided the production of eyes, which are clearly for seeing. I agree that the evolution of human beings is immensely improbable. But of course, improbable events happen all the time. I live in New York City, and believe me, in a city of 9 million people, things with 1,000,000 to 1 odds happen 9 times a day. Most importantly, with the help of evolutionary theory, we can give a detailed account of why the evolution of humans was so improbable and how it happened anyway. In any case, the rest of my rejoinders will have to wait until the final section. Thank you.